Canada. You share the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. Your entire defense strategy is basically glued to the hip of the US military. You use the same ammo, you use the same radios, you fly in the same formations. It makes perfect sense, right? Standardization is the holy grail of logistics. But then you look at the Canadian Army's heavy armor, and something doesn't add up. Instead of the American M1 Abrams, the Canadians are driving German Leopard 2. Why? Why would Canada ignore the massive industrial machine of their closest ally and go all the way to Europe to buy their main battle tank? Let's go back to the beginning of this century. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union is gone. The buzzword in the Pentagon and in Ottawa is transformation. The idea was that future wars would be fought by light, fast, wheeled vehicles. The era of the heavy main battle tank was supposed to be over. In fact, the Canadian leadership was so convinced of this that they actually planned to scrap their entire fleet of old Leopard 1 tanks and replace them with, get this, the Striker mobile gun system, a wheeled vehicle with a gun on top. But then, reality punched them in the face. It's called Afghanistan. Specifically, Operation Medusa in 2006. The Canadians found themselves in fierce combat with the Taliban in the Panjwai district. And guess what? Those light and agile wheeled vehicles? They were getting chewed up. RPGs, IEDs, heavy machine gun fire. The Canadians were taking casualties. And they realized that speed doesn't matter if you can't survive a hit. So, the Canadian government had to reverse course instantly. They needed to buy a main battle tank to save their troops. And this is where the fork in the road appears. On one side, you have the American M1 Abrams. On the other, the German Leopard 2. The clock is ticking. Now, on paper, the M1 Abrams were the obvious choice. The US was right there in Afghanistan with Canada. They had thousands of tanks. They could have loaned Canada a battalion of Abrams overnight. So why didn't it happen? The answer comes down to one word: logistics. Specifically, the engine. The M1 Abrams is unique. It doesn't use a normal engine. It uses the Honeywell AGT 1500 gas turbine. It is basically a jet engine stuffed into the back of a tank. Is it powerful? Absolutely. But here is a conflict point. It is thirsty. It is devastatingly, uncontrollably thirsty. An Abrams tank idling, just sitting still, burns fuel at a rate that makes logisticians cry. In high-intensity operations, the U.S. Army builds a Steel River fuel trucks just to keep these beasts moving. For the United States, that's fine. The U.S. military is a logistics superpower. They can move oceans of fuel anywhere on Earth. But Canada? Canada is a middle power. The logistics tail is thin. They don't have thousands of fuel trucks. Compare that to the Leopard 2. The German tank uses a traditional V12 diesel. It's boring, it's loud, but guess what? It gets way better mileage. You can turn it off and it doesn't take 5 minutes to spin back up. For a smaller army operating on a tight budget and with limited supply trucks, the diesel engine isn't just a choice, it's a survival mechanism. The turbine engine of the Abrams was a luxury Canada couldn't afford, not in dollars, but in logistical complexity. But wait, there's another layer to this. It wasn't just about engines. It was about speed of delivery. Remember, Canada was in the middle of a war. They didn't have 5 years to wait for General Dynamics to build them brand new M1A2 tanks from a factory in Ohio. They needed tanks now. The Americans, despite having thousands of tanks in storage, didn't have a surplus of export-ready updated variants just sitting around that fit Canada's specific needs without a massive overhaul. But Europe? Europe was having a fire sale. The Cold War was over, and European nations were slashing their armies. The Dutch and the Germans had hundreds of high-quality Leopard 2A4 and 2A6 tanks sitting in warehouses. So Canada did something brilliant. They literally leased tanks. They borrowed 20 Leopard 2A6M from the German army, upgraded them with slat armor, and flew them straight into the Kandahar sandbox. Think about the absurdity of that. A NATO country, fighting a war, had to rent its main battle weapon because they had been so short-sighted years before. But this accidental choice sealed the fate of the Abrams in Canada. Once the infrastructure was set up for those rented Leopards, the mechanics, the tools, the spare parts, There was no going back. The Leopard had dug its claws in. And here's the kicker. The Abrams has a proprietary feel to it. The Chobham and depleted uranium armor package is highly classified. The US is very stingy about who gets the good stuff. If Canada bought the Abrams, they might have gotten the export armor package, tungsten instead of uranium. With the Leopard, Canada was getting the same top-tier tank that the German army used. No monkey models. Let's shift gears from the desert of Kandahar to the frozen tundra of the Arctic. Because if you are Canada, you aren't just fighting terrorists. You are defending the North. How does the M1 Abrams handle the extreme cold? Compared to the Leopard 2, there's a myth that the gas turbine starts better in the cold. That's actually true. Jet engines love cold air. However, there's a massive tactical downside to the Abrams in the North. Heat signature. The exhaust from an Abrams turbine comes out at roughly 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In the frozen Arctic, where everything is sub-zero, an Abrams tank looks like a supernova on a thermal camera. It creates a massive plume that says, "Shoot me." The Leopard's diesel exhaust is cooler. It's easier to mask. Furthermore, the track pressure. Canada needed a tank with lower ground pressure to navigate snow and boggy terrain. The Leopard 2, while heavy, was designed to the forests and marshes of Central Europe. It handles soft ground slightly better than the sheer brute force approach of the American tank. Plus, think about maintenance. If an engine breaks down at minus 40 degrees in the Yukon, fixing a diesel V12 is hard. Fixing a turbine engine in the snow, that requires a level of specialized support equipment that is incredibly hard to maintain in the field. The Leopard is simply a more rugged, grunt-proof piece of machinery for Canadian reality. Also, the Leopard 2 is a Euro tank. It is used by Germany, Poland, Spain, Denmark, Norway. The list goes on. This means Canada enters a global club of users. They can share data, training, and upgrades with a dozen countries, not just one. It gave Canada a way to integrate more deeply with its European NATO allies, rather than just being a sidekick to the US Army. It was a geopolitical hedge. A way to say, we stand with America, but we buy from Germany. We've talked logistics, politics, and engines. But let's be real, who wins in a fight? If Canada had to fight a peer adversary, did they make the right choice in terms of pure killing power? Both the M1A2 and the Leopard 2 used a Rheinmetall 120mm smoothbore cannon design. The Abrams uses the L44, a slightly shorter version, while newer Leopards use the L55, the longer barrel. This means the Canadian Leopards actually have a slight range and penetration advantage over the standard US Abrams because of that longer barrel. The longer the barrel, the faster the shell flies, the harder it hits. However, the Abrams has superior depleted uranium ammunition, the silver bullet, which the US generally doesn't export. Canada, using the Leopard, relies on tungsten penetrators. Is there a difference? Yes. Depleted uranium is a better metal eater. But in 99% of combat scenarios, a tungsten dart moving at Mach 5 will kill anything it touches. In terms of fire control systems, the Leopard 2 is legendary for its stability. You have probably seen the video of the German tank balancing a beer stein on its barrel while moving. That isn't a trick. It's engineering perfection. The Abrams is brutal and robust. The Leopard is precise and refined. For Canada, which has a small army that relies on highly trained, professional soldiers, the precision instrument of the Leopard fit their ethos perfectly. So, did Canada make the right call? Absolutely. For a massive military like the US, the logistical burden of the Abrams is a rounding error. For Canada, it would have been a shackle. The Abrams is an incredible tank. Maybe the best tank ever built for the American way of war. But Canada isn't America. They don't fight with overwhelming waves of logistics. They fight with efficiency. Sometimes, the best weapon isn't the one with the biggest engine or the thickest classified armor. It's the one you can actually keep running when the supply truck is 500 miles behind you and the snow is falling. And in the unforgiving math of warfare, that is the only choice that matters.